Welcome back. We're discussing the crisis summit held by the leaders of the world's biggest 20 economies in London today and whether their ideas can heal the world economy. I'm joined in London by veteran British politician Tony Benn and the Financial Secretary to the UK Treasury, Stephen Timms. But first, joining us on the telephone from London, we have Dr. Kumi Naidu, one of the founders of the Global Call to Action Against Poverty, a civil society movement of activists in 100 countries. Kumi, thanks for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Now, you've been in London at the summit. Do you believe that the summit adequately addressed the plight of developing countries?
Far from it. I think that you can't use the same solutions and thinking that got you in the crisis to actually solve the crisis. And when you go through the text of the communique, the devil is always in the detail. There are many people in the developing world who are thinking, how is it that you can write off the toxic debt in such large numbers that run into trillions? And we've been appealing for third world debt to be written off, a commitment made in Gleneagles in 2005 and not yet fully fulfilled, when in fact, that would cost just 500 billion. So the other question we would have is that many of the commitments made here on concluding the Doha trade round, on more aid and so on, were made in 2005. Even before the global financial crisis hit, most of the G8 countries were actually running behind in those commitments. So for many of us, we are skeptical. And also we have to ask the question of the quality of growth. Tony Benn is absolutely right. We have a problem here of growth that is what you could call jobless growth. We've got growth that is deepening inequality in virtually every country around the world. And what's on the table will not encourage lots of people and close to 100 million more people that in the next 6 months could slip into poverty.
There were a number of news conferences after this summit held by different leaders that attended the summit, and many of them spoke about jobs and the creation of millions of jobs. Do you think this summit was a job creation meeting?
Well, I think, some of us have said a good crisis is a terrible thing to squander. And that's what has happened here. We could have turned this crisis into an opportunity if, in fact, rather than in the very last words of the communique, adding bland references to greening the world's economy. And there should have been a much more closer linkage between the climate catastrophe that we find ourselves in and to have more clear, explicit statements of how we're going to create more decent work and green sustainable jobs. Because at the end of the day, to fight poverty, to boost the economy and so on, employment is critical. And even though there are references to jobs, they do not suggest that in fact there is going to be a significant increase in jobs. The language is very, very important to look at carefully because it talks about sustaining existing jobs and creating. So when you have that two options, I think really the summit, in the main, its outcomes at best, and I don't think it will succeed in that, is in terms of sustaining existing jobs.
Okay, stay with us. I just want to go to the phones right now. We have a caller from Zurich. This is Arun calling from Zurich. Go ahead, Arun.
Yes, good evening, gentlemen. I'd like to ask both the gentlemen why they feel that there was no mention whatsoever about workers' rights in this rather boring document. It's a terribly boring document. And, there's this outrageous contempt for working people. These are the guys who are going to suffer. You wake up tomorrow, you don't have a job. Or, as Lord Ben has said, 47 million don't have health insurance in the States. There is not one mention of working people's rights. And I think the only or erstwhile union leader at this conference, which seems to me to have been a waste of time, was Mr. Lula. What about working people?
Okay.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me go first to Stephen Timms.
Let me respond, if I may, first of all, to a couple of Kumi's points. I agree with him about the need for the commitments that have been made on aid to debt cancellation to be delivered. And I think it was very welcome and very significant that we secured a recommitment to what's been promised in the communique today. Of course, in the UK, we are on track to deliver what we've promised. In some other countries that isn't the case. So it is important that we've secured those recommitments today. But you know, this whole summit is about jobs, growth, stability. That's the slogan for the summit. It's entirely about stopping the increase in unemployment that we're seeing at the moment and returning to growth in employment and to jobs. And on the point about workers' rights, what we have done, and this is actually pretty unusual for events of this kind, we have called on the International Labour Organization in the communique. Now that's a very doughty defender of employment rights. We want that. They want the ILO to be involved in watching what happens from this summit, and we think that'll be very helpful in making sure we get the right outcome for quality employment.
Tony Benn, was that enough consultation with the International Labour Organization?
No, of course it wasn't. You see, the wealth of the world is created by the workers of the world, and the wealth of the world is owned by a handful of people who are very, very rich. And democracy, as I said, transfers power by giving the poor equal powers, each of them, as the rich. And that's why nobody in power really likes democracy very much. Then the other question is the criterion for jobs. Now take a very simple example in Britain. We have, I think, the longest waiting list for houses provided by local authorities, and we have unemployed building workers who would like to build them. And therefore the question you have to ask is your production for profit or for need? And if it's for need, then obviously working people through their trade unions have got to have rights, have got to be listened to, have got to be equal partners, at least equal partners. And Mrs. Thatcher took away trade union rights in Britain. They've never been fully restored. And believe it or not, trade union rights in Britain today are more repressive than they were 100 years ago. So I think this does raise very interesting questions. I don't want to be negative, I just want to open up questions that have not been discussed at this summit because they don't fit in with the sort of idea that somehow remove toxic debt and tax havens and capitalism will spring into life again. I'm afraid it won't.
Well, let's go to another one of our callers, Kadira, calling from the United Kingdom. Kadira?
Hi, yeah, my name's Kadir. Good evening, gentlemen. I actually want to go back to UK specific and in particular Germany's stance on regulation. I'm an IFA myself, and I think there hasn't been enough done in terms of regulation. Specifically to the UK, we have the Financial Services Authority that looks after the whole financial sector, and I think what the government should have done is created a regulator on its own which looks after banks, because I just don't believe that the FSA have the necessary means to tackle that problem. That was my first point. And second point is that as an IFA myself, our costs have gone up 36% because to look after this regulation. Why should we pay for it when it's the banks who made the mess? And lastly, to Tony Benn, if I could make one point. If you can sort of, because I know he's always championed the third world. IMF has always been used by rich countries as a whip, really, because what they do, they lend money to dictators, knowing these people will never use it for the rightful means, and then they use it as a political sort of tool.
Okay, we're running out of time. I'm going to first ask Stephen Timms if you could give us a very quick answer to the first part of that question.
Well, this is a very important issue and one that's very directly addressed in the communique, strengthening regulation of the financial system. And I'd have to say, I don't think there's any doubt it does have to be strengthened, and that is going to, no doubt, incur more costs. We've already heard in the UK, the Financial Services Authority, saying it does need to strengthen its regulatory work with banks, but not only.
Okay, I'm sorry,
banks.
I'm afraid.
And then in the communique.
We've run out of time. My apologies. We've run out of time. Thanks for being with us. On the next show, join Riz in Istanbul, where Barack Obama makes his first presidential visit to a Muslim country. See you next time.